Welcome to Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S.J. Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are podcasts. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of 2 books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of American Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. It's no secret that the Christian church has had a checkered past, to say the least, from the Crusades to the Inquisition, to its complicity with colonialism and even slavery, racism, and sexual abuse. Christianity often gets a bad rap, and sometimes rightly so. But have there been brighter moments when the church has seemed to shine, to grasp what it was established to do? We have with us tonight the Reverend Dr. John Dickson, who is a well-known Australian author, scholar, and speaker, whose work focuses on the intersection of ancient and medieval history, religion, ministry, and media. He's published more than 20 books, among which is one book, most recently, The Bullies and Saints, which takes an honest and balanced look at church history, all in an effort to understand what Christianity has been and what it was meant to be. He's also had numerous academic appointments, and he also is the founder and continuing director of Undeceptions, an organization that seeks to promote truth and deep Christian thought in skeptical times. In fact, his Undeceptions podcast is Australia's most downloaded religious podcast and enjoys a growing international audience. Reverend Dr. John Dickson, thank you so much for making time to be with us, calling from Australia.
SJ, it's great to talk to you, and it's very cold here, and I believe it's quite warm where you are.
It is. It's so humid. I was telling you earlier, it was so humid that I got stuck. The doors in the house are swollen shut, and I got stuck in the bedroom today and had to cry for help until someone came to rescue me. Couldn't get out. It's very, very humid here. But by the way, happy birthday. I understand it was your birthday yesterday in Australia. It's still your birthday here today, so I can say happy birthday.
Isn't it great to be able to talk to Americans, and I can extend my 10th of August birthday?
You can extend the warm wishes and kudos from your friends.
I had to remind my family yesterday morning, or this morning for you, that it was my birthday.
Oh, no. Yeah. Like a lot of us, you actually did not start out to be a Christian scholar and apologist, an ancient historian. Can you outline for us your career journey and for people to get to know you a little bit better, and how you now find yourself in this position of author and speaker and apologist?
Sure. Well, I grew up in a typically pagan Aussie home. So people often think of Australia as quite post-Christian, and I think partly that's a fair judgment. And so I had never been inside a church before I was 16. But I did have a teacher at school who daringly talked of her faith to us, and a bunch of us in the class were intrigued. And so around 16 years of age, having never had any church experience, I found myself quite a fan of Jesus. The Jesus of the four Gospels absolutely captivated me. And I think from that moment on, I had a great sympathy, affection, affinity with skeptical people who, don't believe and think there are reasons not to believe. And so even as a late teenager, I was doing my best to persuade, making lots of mistakes along the way. And the first sort of professional attempt at this was to start a rock band. I had never heard of Christian music, So I know that sounds odd in an American context, but Christian music was hardly anything in Australia in those days. And but my friends and I started a rock band, and we played pubs and clubs and universities and so on, where we would share our faith between songs. We thought we'd come up with the idea. Only later did we learn that there was a Christian music scene. And that was my first career. So for about 6 years after high school, I toured full-time with my best friends, playing music and speaking. And it was that context that convinced me I was shallow, because I would give the same talks and play the same songs in the very next town. And there was no depth. There was, a sort of a superficial impressiveness. And after 6 years, we decided as a band to disband and go and study. And so that's what we did. We turned up at the nerdiest theological college we could find, enrolled ourselves, and, entered into that weird and wonderful journey of biblical and theological studies. And when I completed that, I surprised everyone, including myself, that I did really well and enrolled straight into a master's, and that became a PhD in a secular university focused on ancient history, in the ancient history department at Macquarie University. And along the way, I would also be writing books for the general public. I never saw myself as a brilliant musician, but music was a great way to make Christ public. I never saw myself as a brilliant academic, but learning this stuff was important for making Christ public. And same with the writing books. My English teacher would be surprised that I ever put a book together. And I'm not the world's most literary fellow, but it's a great way to make Christ public. So, even though I've done a bunch of things, whether it's academic or creative, it is for me just one thing. I just have, since I was 16, wanted to make Christ public in a post-Christian, secularizing environment in the West.
Well, just to encourage you, you write very well, and you are a great storyteller, and that is a gift. Not everybody can do that, particularly bringing history alive and telling it as you would a story. You do a great job of that in this book, Bullies and Saints. And you said recently that writing this book was a kind of self-therapy. What did you mean by that, and why did you decide to write this book, and why now?
Well, I guess the quip that it was partly therapy really is because I know where all the bodies are buried in church history. The problem with being a historian is that you have to read the primary sources. You can't just rely on second-hand information. And so the reality is the church of yesteryear, and indeed today, has done terrible things, and often in the name of Christ. And so I think anyone who is honest about this will need to do some therapy. Some people give up on the faith as a result of the bad treatment they've received or seen others receive from the church. And I get that at one level. But for me, studying the primary documents throughout the 2,000 years of church history has convinced me there is a deep darkness that's in the human heart and in the church as well. But there are incredible, beautiful things that the Christians have done in every century that are the true vision of Christianity. And so when I say therapy, I mean I want to know the depths of the darkness so I can be realistic with myself. And I want to know the beauty that is possible, and then aim for that. So the book is neither an attempt to criticize the church, and that's all the rage at the moment. Let's just criticize Christianity. But nor is it an attempt to whitewash. I really am trying to be honest about the bullies and the saints who have been leaders in the Christian church through the centuries.
Well, you're certainly right about church history. It is not for the faint of heart. And I remember teaching a 6-week outline of church history to my church leaders when I was pastoring, and after we finished the early church, got away about halfway through, I noticed people were looking rather pale and rather white in the face, and asking me, "Why did this happen?" And I was sort of into it, I guess, at that point, because I taught it so often that I didn't realize how really disappointing and shocking it all is, especially for someone who's perhaps a new Christian. So yes, I can understand that. Why do you think it's important for Christians to know about church history? I find that many Christians really don't know that much about church history. And why do you think it's important for them to know things that you talk about in your book?
Well, my general defense of history as a discipline is that it is a kind of ultimate act of democracy. It is because when you're studying, if you study just now, if you're just reading contemporary things and not the past, you're listening only to the blip that exists in the present. Whereas the historian wants to listen both to the present and to the whole sweep of human wisdom and human failure. And so I just think it's democratic. I want to know what 3rd century Christians said about power and politics. I want to know what 9th century Christians did wrong and right. And I want to learn from all of them. I want to give the voice not just to the present, but to the past. And of course, I think it was G.K. Chesterton, the great British literati, who said something similar about tradition. Said tradition is democracy because you're giving a voice to the people long dead, not just a voice to the people who live today. And I think the same about history. So Christians ought to know their own history, if only to have a broader perspective. And I do believe when you study church history, at some depth, you will simultaneously feel flattened by the failings that are there, but I also think inspired by the possibilities. Because although we can say Inquisitions, Crusades, and throw up our hands and think, how could anyone in the name of Christ do that? We also have 7th century slave freeing movements, long before the abolitionist movement of the modern world, and we can learn from that. We have the birth of hospitals, which was led by the church in the 4th century and became universal health care by about the 7th or 8th century in Europe, all run by the church. So I think there are lessons we can learn, as well as blows across the head that we need to endure.
Well, this is a rigorously researched book. When I was reading it, as a lover of history, I said, I'm in really good hands here. But it's also a remarkably honest book. And it shows 2,000 years of church history, warts and all, without trying to excuse or, explain away what you need to call it evil, evil committed by so-called Christians over the ages. This is an approach, I think this honest approach is really quite disarming. And I was wondering what sort of reaction has that received, both within the church and outside of the church?
Generally, really positive reaction. Apart from one very recent review in First Things, the big conservative Catholic magazine. They didn't like me at all. They thought I was some crazy lefty. A MAGA-hating lefty. And I wanted to just scream, I'm an Australian! I don't know! Don't call me those American names. But overall, really positive, including amongst atheists. So there's a quite well-known website and historian reviewer called History for Atheists, and Tim O'Neill, the scholar there, often dislikes Christian apologetics books, but he did a lovely review of mine, and said, well, I certainly can't accuse him of being biased, and I felt that was the greatest compliment, to have an atheist say, wow, this feels like a reliable history. And in fact, the only technical point he picked up on in his review was he felt I was too harsh on 5th century Alexandrian Christians. So, not that I was too soft, I was too harsh. So I quite like that.
You could lighten up a little bit, I guess. That's funny. I did read some of that review.
I think that, when you're a Christian, we know we're not good through and through, right? We don't believe that secular myth that we're good and only getting better. So a Christian's instinct ought to be able to confess our wrongs and, take the log or plank out of our eye before we can see clearly others. So it ought to be second nature, is what I'm saying, to be honest about the failings.
Right. Certainly humility is a Christian value that we all too often forget about, and just realizing that we have the freedom to say, look, we did this wrong, because we know that we stand in Christ, and that He is a forgiving God.
Yes.
Now, the Church has not always been responsible for every evil thing that's happened in the world, but certainly complicit in a great many of the evils of world history, such as the Crusades, the Inquisition, colonialism, slavery, racism, and so forth. And I find that most of this complicity comes because of the Church's need to be close to political power. How do you explain how an institution designed for the uplift of humanity has at times become such a millstone around its neck?
Yeah, I feel quite ambivalent about this problem. I have simultaneously contradictory feelings about it. So on the one hand, Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century, the first Christian emperor, invited bishops, to sit at the table of power. And while people often say, and that was the beginning of the end for the Church, actually the primary sources don't bear that out. What actually happened in Constantine's time is that Christians were able to build their charitable institutions, build more hospitals. Roman laws were changed so that churches could free slaves. Churches became tax-free because they looked after the poor. And so, on the one hand, it looks like the church cozying up to power, but on the other, that power only allowed them to do more good in society. Now, I say that with some reservation, because about 60 years after Constantine, when Christianity is now really embedded in power, it starts to turn against all pagans, and the sort of pagan religion, the traditional Greek and Roman religion, starts to be persecuted by the Christians. So, the bullied are now the bullies. And so I look at those two ends of the 4th century, and I see a paradox, or at least possibilities. I see it's possible for churches to be invited into conversation with power and do enormous good as a result, in persuasion, in charity, and so on. And then it's possible for the church of the late 4th century to be so embedded in power that the bishops are now telling the emperors what to do, and that does seem to be a problem. So I'm not against power, per se. I don't want to offer the kind of critical theory of Derrida and Foucault and those guys who say, power is evil always. I think when the church sits loosely to temporal power and only desires to do good with it and is happy to lay it down for the good of others, I think that context can do enormous good. But when they're grasping for power, they become bullies, and I think the beautiful melody of Jesus, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, starts to be drowned out by a very different kind of message. So I'm ambivalent about it, and I don't know how to resolve it, except I look today and I think, well, you see the same things today. Sometimes you see Christians who are invited into the halls of power, but use it wisely and humbly for the good of others, not for themselves. And I can celebrate that. And yet, when Christians feel they can call the shots, feel that their mission is a cultural or sociological mission rather than a spiritual mission, a mission of serving, that's when problems emerge and Christ's name is dishonored in public.
You start your book talking about the Crusades. So you don't necessarily start from the beginning, but you talk about this event in about the 11th century. It started. Why did you choose to start with that? And were there any redeeming features at all about the Crusades?
I started with the Crusades because it's the ultimate cliche, So if you're at a party and your friend who doesn't believe says, Christians have always done evil, they started all the wars, and you say, which ones? They'll say the Crusades. So I thought it's not a bad place to start. And in any case, it's the middle of the Christian story. So it's the 11th century, the late 11th century, and so it's roughly the middle of Christian history. And it is a dark period. There are many dark aspects of the Crusades. So I thought it would be interesting. I don't know how successful I pulled it off, but I thought it would be interesting to start with that dark spot in the middle of the Christian story, of Christian history. And after telling that, wind back and ask the question, how on earth the people who followed a crucified king, the servant Lord, how could they end up thinking it was godly to slaughter Muslims? And then I wind back in, I can't remember, it's like chapter 4 or something. I start to wind back to the 1st century and creep our way through, back up to the Crusades. Are there any redeeming features of the Crusades? Look, again, I feel so conflicted about the Crusades. I don't want to be an apologist for the Crusades, and that's quite a tradition at the moment. But nor do I want to fall into the cliche, because I look at the Crusades and I think, well, if we were there in 11th century France, and we learned that Islamic armies had brilliantly and successfully taken all of the Holy Land, all of Egypt, had made their way across North Africa, had taken Spain, and now were knocking on the door of the last remnant of Eastern Christianity in Constantinople. And the Christian Byzantine emperor writes to the Pope and the Western Pope and says, look, it's going to be the end of Eastern Christianity if Muslims, take us as well. And then you never know, they might take you next. And so that's the context, okay? And so because I'm not an absolute pacifist in that sort of Anabaptist tradition, I don't believe all warfare is sinful. I do believe there is such a thing as just war. And if I squint, I can see a way to think of the First Crusade as a just war in its justification, in the reason thousands left Europe to go and try and preserve Constantinople and then try and take Jerusalem back which had been in Christian hands for centuries, but Islamic armies had taken it. So I can see a reason why they did it. And they were meant to follow just war principles, which always meant it had to be a defensive war, it had to be proportional, you had to conduct yourselves in a way in warfare that didn't leave the loser resenting your behaviour. The problem is, the way the Crusades were conducted, even the First Crusade, completely undid any claim that the Crusade was a just war. I can say it was a just cause, but the way they conducted themselves, I think, was disgusting. They slaughtered Jewish villages along the Rhineland on their way from France to Turkey and then down into Israel. They found Jewish villages and just destroyed them, partly as payback for killing Christ, as they saw it, partly as warfare practice on the way to the Muslim lands by then. And when they got to Jerusalem and took the city on July 15th, 1099, instead of following the just war principle of preserving non-combatants, and women and children in particular, our Crusaders, all of whom thought they were honouring Jesus, slaughtered men, women and children. They showed no mercy whatsoever. We have the primary documents. We have the letters of the Crusaders back home. And so we know what they did, and we know how proud they were of it. And on July 16, 1099, they held a church service to praise Jesus for this vindication of Christianity over the evil Muslims. Now I look at that and I think, well, whatever justification there was for the Crusade, there's no way I can see the Crusade, even the First Crusade, as a just war in its conduct.
What about the Inquisition? That's another one of those, like you said, the cliches that people bring up at the cocktail party. You know, what about the Inquisition? It's sort of like showing a cross to a vampire just to get rid of you. You know, that you'll have no response to that. You know, what about that? What do you write about that in your book?
Well, again, I mean, it's complex, et cetera, but the thing to hold in mind about the Inquisitions, well, there are so many things to hold in mind. So the reason the Inquisition seemed plausible to Christians in this period is that a few centuries before the Inquisitions, they had stupidly, the Christian culture had stupidly adopted Roman law concerning torture. So it was a long-established rule in Roman law that torture was, you know, justified in order to extract truth and to turn the wayward to the right path. And when Christianized Europe sort of scratched around for a legal code, they adopted Roman legal code, which justified torture. Now, Christians didn't use it very much. Christian Europe didn't use torture very much, but it was there on the books. And eventually, by the time we get to the great heresy trials of the 11, 12, 13, 1400s, they start to use this thing on the books called torture. And because these were ostensibly Christian lands, people who were heretics, people who were saying, you know, Jesus wasn't God or something like that, would be interviewed, and if they didn't repent, they'd be slightly tortured. If they didn't repent, they'd be heavily tortured. If they did repent, then they'd just have to do some kind of penance. They have to, you know, wear funny clothing and pray prayers and maybe go on a pilgrimage. And that's basically what the Inquisitions were about, trying to root out heresy in Christian lands. Now, it is unthinkable for me now to think, how did Christians think it was plausible to torture people over their views? And I can't justify that. I'm glad, you know, it was reformed. But I will say this about the Inquisitions, and until I really started to investigate the Inquisitions and read some of the primary documents that we have, and we now have a treasure trove of primary documents. Until then, I only thought negatively about the Inquisitions. But when you read the actual texts from the time, it is very clear that they were considered by people of the day the most just, fairest, gentlest of all the courts of Europe. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but we actually have letters that are petitions to local authorities begging to be removed from the secular courts to go into the Inquisition courts. And the reason was that everyone knew in an Inquisition prison and an Inquisition court, you got meals, you had a clean cell, and there were rules of investigation that were followed. And in secular courts, not so much. So I would just say, yes, Inquisitions were terrible, but if we were there, we would say, probably, they were the best courts we've got. And the only other thing I would throw out...
The torture was much better in the Inquisition courts.
Well, and the fact is, actually, they killed very few people compared to the secular courts. So the Inquisitions used execution sparingly. Now, I say that, but, I mean, sadly, our best numbers tell us that about 5,000 to 6,000 people were executed by the Inquisition courts over 350 years. So 5,000 to 6,000 people, 350 years. Now, obviously, one death for heresy is, in my view, a blasphemy. But when you think of other things going on in this same period, the Inquisitions would hardly rate a mention in the history of cruelty. You just think of, say, the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, an entirely secular revolution, 17,000 people were executed in just 9 months, all in the name of secular liberty. And yet no one is, crying out today, oh, the French, or, oh, secular liberty, you've caused all the wars of history. I want to take a historical view and say, although I can look back on the Inquisitions and see them as terrible and wonder how on earth that blind spot developed, I also am aware that at the time they were viewed almost positively by the population, and they were nowhere near as bloody as other secular movements.
Talk about the so-called Dark Ages, put that term in quotes because it's a disputable description of the period, talking about roughly about the 5th to 10th century, from the fall of the Roman Empire in the West to the period just before the Crusades. You have your own sort of take on its significance.
Yes. Well, it's not historical revisionism to point out that the slogan, the Dark Ages, was actually popularized as a piece of propaganda, as a way of dismissing the period before the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Enlightenment. And so there's been quite a bit of work on how this idea of the Dark Ages developed. Because anyone who is a medieval historian, who knows the Middle Ages well, knows that you've got all sorts of wonderful reforms and Renaissance happening in the 8th century, 9th century, 10th century. There's poetry, there's art, there's architecture, there's educational programs. There are all sorts of amazing, wonderful things going on. So how did they get lumped together into this idea of a Dark Ages? And the best scholarship has revealed that it really was a combination of the early Renaissance, so 14th century Italians described the period just before them as a dark period. They actually used the word dark. And what they meant was not everything the word came to mean when we say Dark Ages. They meant that the great classical writings of Cicero and Seneca and Aristotle and Plato hadn't been as widely studied through that period as they came to be in the Renaissance period of the 14th century. And so they thought it was darkness in that sense. But what happened is that in the Reformation, the 16th century Reformation, reformers, Protestant reformers, picked up this language of darkness and applied it to the Catholic period, because their view was the Catholics had hidden the gospel and had darkened the human race. And so Luther calls the period a dark age. And this became such a popular way of describing the Middle Ages that the insult about that period became very popular in Europe. So by the time you get to the Enlightenment, which comes after the Reformation, so we're talking now the 17th century and 18th century, once you get to the Enlightenment and there's a great turning against the church, people really use the term Dark Ages, having picked it up from the Protestant Reformation and from the Renaissance scholars, and describe the whole show as dark. It was dark in terms of violence, it was dark in terms of knowledge, it was dark in terms of art. And the very notion that we have arrived at an enlightenment meant that we had to exaggerate the past as dark. If we want to be the light, that is the dark. And so that's the story of how we came to refer to this period as Dark Ages. But professors of Middle Ages, medieval experts around the world, wince whenever anyone calls that a Dark Ages and means that it was dark in knowledge and art and so on, because it clearly wasn't. That's what I want to say about the Dark Ages. It's a good example of how we can end up thinking about history almost entirely in terms of propaganda, but we're unaware of it. We're unaware that we think of 500 AD to say 1500 AD as Dark Ages because of a piece of propaganda designed to make that period seem worse than it really was.
Certainly, when I think of that period, what comes to mind is the blooming of monasticism, which certainly was not a darkness at all. The blooming of Irish Christianity, so many points of light there. Certainly, there was some lawlessness after the breakdown of the structure of the Roman Empire, but so many things rose up to take its place, which we may just take for granted. But you talk about bullies and saints in the sense that it's much easier to be a bully than a saint. So there are more of those than the other. But many of the saints are not well known to us. Most of us who have not studied, history. Who are some of these saints that you think are worthy of emulation? And maybe I can just throw out a name, and if you don't mind, sort of quizzing you on what would you say about that person? Basil of Caesarea, for example.
Yeah, he's also called Basil the Great, and for good reason. He was one of the famous Cappadocian fathers, and anyone who goes to seminary learns about the Cappadocian fathers because they were the best at explaining the Trinity in the 4th century. They had worked out brilliant ways to explain the Trinity to a wider pagan population. But Basil became bishop, and we're about the 360s now. exile, AD 360, so 20, 30 years after Constantine. And yes, he was a brilliant academic. I mean, he had himself been trained in the Academy of Athens, and he was revered. But he was also absolutely committed to the vulnerable. And it was a good example of someone who sociologically had power, but used that power for the good of others. And perhaps the most remarkable and long-lasting thing he did was establish what he just called his poorhouse. But it was actually a complex of, we'd have to call it a hospital, because he had rooms for lepers, rooms for the sick, and he employed nurses and doctors to look after the sick. There was a building for foundlings, because the church in this period was still picking up exposed or discarded infants and raising them. This idea, this poorhouse, is really the beginning of the hospital. And Basil really did employ doctors and used the best Greek medicine to look after these people. And it was a huge hit, so that within about 20 or 30 years, people were replicating it. Down in Rome, a woman called Fabiola, a Christian woman called Fabiola, a very wealthy woman, used her money to build a hospital, very much like what Basil had done over in what we call Turkey. And her hospital was a place for people for rich and poor to come and get well, or it was a hospice and they died with dignity. In the next century, this became an expectation that churches would build hospitals, so that by the time you get to, say, 8th century, there are literally thousands of church-run hospitals. So it all comes from Basil. He established, so far as we know, the first public hospital in history.
Now, here's a name that I was not familiar with, and I don't know why, no good reason. Bishop Eligius.
Oh, you've chosen the best ones. Yeah. So he's actually a jewelry maker and a goldsmith in France in the 600s. So right in what some people call the Dark Ages. And, he is making jewelry for kings and queens and all the nobles, and had become quite wealthy as a result of his trade. But he was also a pious man, and according to the reports we have, which were quite contemporary, he would be designing and making his jewelry and doing the gold smelting and all that sort of stuff while reading the Bible, reading the fathers of the church, reading Augustine, and so on. And so he was an artist and a nerd and a wealthy man. And it got to the point where he felt so convicted about his wealth that he would go on journeys dressed like a king, with robes and silks and jewels studded into his clothing. He would go out and he would find the poor, and he would find especially slaves who were still being sold in the slave markets, the sort of the remnant of the Roman slave trade. And everyone was doing slavery in that period, but the remnants of the Roman slave trade were still there. And he started using his wealth to purchase slaves to free them. He would buy them at the markets and free them. And it was said by the biography that was written just a few years after he died that he would go out dressed like a king and come back looking like a pauper, because he would just rip off the jewels off his clothing and use them to buy slaves, and he'd come back with no money at all. He eventually went into the ministry and became a pastor, or we have to use the ancient language, a priest, and they eventually made him a bishop, and he did not change his tune even when he became a bishop. He insisted that everyone who wants to follow Christ must free their slaves, must care for the poor, and more than that, he wasn't just a kind of social justice warrior, he was an evangelist. He would go on very scary journeys to Frisia, sort of Belgium, Holland, which still hadn't been converted, and he would go and preach to them and evangelize. And we're told in the texts about him that he had great success, that people would give up their idol worship and follow Jesus Christ as a result of what this man did.
How about some of the great women in the church who often get overlooked? Hildegard of Bingen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right that women do get overlooked, but they're everywhere in our sources, and you find this, in the early centuries. So we have in the 2nd century, we've got a document by Pliny, the Roman governor who persecuted Christians around the year 112. He says that in order to get to the bottom of what Christianity was about, he tortured 2 slave women whom the churches called deacons. And so I find that a really interesting clue that when a Roman governor wants to know what Christians are about, he got women to tell him, and he tortured them. He tortured them to learn what Christianity was about. And so they are, unfortunately, we don't know their names, but they are there in every century. And you mentioned Hildegard of Bingen. She was a Benedictine abbess. So the Benedictines were, the most famous and influential monasteries, and she led a female monastery that followed the rule of Benedict, which is all about caring for the poor and so on. And she was charismatic and zealous, and surprisingly, or to us it may sound surprising, though she's in this Middle Ages period, 11th and 12th centuries, she was a scholar, and she had read all of the literature available. She wrote poetry, she wrote theology, she wrote medical treatises, and published them, and was revered. And the clergy of the time, so we're 12th century here, was so impressed with her, they would invite her to come and teach them. And so she went on, I guess we'd call it, preaching missions throughout Europe to help the clergy think through theology and medicine and the way of Christ in the world. She was remarkable.
One last one, Catherine of Siena.
Mm-hmm. Again, she's a little bit later than Hildegard, 14th century, but she was incredibly learned, and not just learned. She was high-born, reasonably high-born, and yet she was quite sick as a teenager, and was disfigured and couldn't marry, but she was very happy with that because she wanted to give herself to mission, to caring for the sick and the poor, and leading sinners to Christ. That's how she described what she was about. And men and women listened to her. She was sort of this charismatic, hyper-intelligent, pious woman. And we have many of her letters, hundreds of her letters. And the extraordinary thing is her correspondence were not just, friends and, people at court and so on, but she wrote to popes. She wrote even to prostitutes. We have a couple of letters that she wrote to prostitutes, urging them, with grace, urging them to the life of Christ. And the Pope at the time, Pope Gregory, was one of her confidants. So she was his confidant, rather. He would seek her advice, And so she would write to him and explain the way of Christ to him. And she, in fact, advised him to move the papal residence from the south of France, which is where the popes were in this period, back to Rome, the spiritual center. And the Pope did exactly what Catherine of Siena did. So yes, she was a remarkable woman, and a good example of what we talked about earlier. Someone who had access to power, was invited into all of the conversations. You know, she was in the room where it happened, and yet she always did it for Christ. She, the cross of Jesus for her was everything. Christ had given himself for her, and her theology said, well, I just give myself for others. That's how you respond to the sacrifice of Christ, out of thankfulness for the forgiveness that she had won. She gave herself for others and had a massive impact. But as you say, her name isn't remembered as much as it probably should.
Well, thank you for those descriptions. I hope that whets the appetite of some of our listeners to explore those figures and more, and definitely to read your book. One last question. We are living in some dark times politically here in the U.S., and the church is not necessarily solely responsible, but let's say it has played a large role and been very complicit in problems that we're having politically here. It's not the first time that the church has been in bed with authoritarianism, and what's happening in Russia today is another example with the Russian Orthodox Church, the leadership of that. And how do you respond to that? And how do you feel about, on the eve of your going to America, coming in and entering this maelstrom? Do you have any trepidations, or do you feel the Lord has given you any clear direction of what you're to do or say?
Not really.
Difficult question.
I mean, it's difficult for me. I'm a complete outsider. I catch glimpses of it, in the Australian media, but I see enough of it here in Australia too. All I know is that the church is usually at its best when it sits very loosely to power. I'm not saying that the church shouldn't do anything political. I'm not saying, it should never have any power. I'm saying the church is at its best when it sits loosely to power. When it feels surprised that anyone would, invite them to the table of power, and that surprise causes us to feel joy and cheerfulness, a willingness to persuade about the good, but also a willingness to lose well. I think of church history. One of the key ways the church won the world was by knowing how to lose well, by which I mean, when the world rebels against the church, against the gospel, and slaps the church around the face, the best churches just smiled sweetly at their persecutors and said, "Oh well, if you don't mind, we'll keep praying for you, and we're not going to stop telling our story of the crucified and risen Lord." And that ability to lose well, in a strange kind of way, won the hearts and minds of onlookers. But when the church is grasping for power, desperate for political sway, I think it doesn't look like the gospel. And so onlookers find that puzzling. They put the church just in the category of another political party. And that is terrible for the gospel, because, of course, we're not. So I guess I'm saying, as I look back on church history, when the church can comfortably walk in the halls of power, but do so with a sweetness and a lightness and an ability to let it go, if need be, then that's when the church can really shine.
Yeah, that's good advice. What do you think is the role of pastors and priests and church leaders at this time in history. We're charged with defending the faith, certainly. We also serve a God of truth. How do you avoid throwing the baby out with the bathwater? When you're... go ahead.
We are to persuade about the good. That's how we should think of it. So it isn't our role. I mean, I'm coming from an Australian perspective. It isn't our role to champion one political party. And it is one of the interesting differences between Australia and America, and I don't know how I'm going to get my head around it. In Australia, it is considered the height of bad taste for a pastor to openly advocate for a political party or even a political candidate. It's looked down on. It's almost a betrayal of the gospel. And the reason for that is that as soon as you publicly align yourself with one team, you are almost by definition giving up any ability to communicate to people who follow the other team. So you're making a choice to be political more than gospel. And so I don't know how I'm going to get my head around the context where it's almost the norm for pastors to support one party or other, or one candidate or another. Ask me in a year how I'm going with that. But I tell you what I do believe. Pastors speaking about the good. Keep it on the issues. Talk about the issues. Persuade, but do it in a way that leaves people guessing whether you're a tribal person. And hopefully they won't think you're a tribal person. You just have a vision of the good, and you want people to embrace it. You're a beggar who has found some bread, and you want to share it around. That should be the posture of the church.
Well, that's a great note to end on, and I want to thank you. We've been talking with Reverend Dr. John Dickson, who is the author of Bullies and Saints, a very honest history of 2,000 years of Christianity. Recommended. It's available on Amazon and other booksellers online and other bookstores, I believe.
Yeah, everywhere.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for making time with us. And again, happy birthday to you, and God bless you in your role and in your new journey here, coming to the States. We wish you a happy voyage and peaceful transition into your new work.
Thank you so much, SJ.
And thanks again. Thanks to all of you for tuning in and listening. This is Pastor S.J. Munson signing off.